She walked into the shop just before closing, the kind of timing that tests your patience but makes you grateful for the interruption. I was bent over a half-finished carburetor, hands black with grease, music low in the background, some old acoustic song bleeding from the radio. Then the bell above the door chimed, soft but sharp, and I looked up. She wasn't what I expected. Mid-40s, maybe older, not the sort who usually wanders into a small-town repair shop. Her hair was tied back, though strands had fallen loose near her cheek, like even her neatness couldn't help being a little undone. She hesitated near the door, eyes scanning the room, calm, assessing. I wiped my hands on a rag, pretending not to notice the faint scent of her perfume that somehow cut through the oil and metal. "My car's making a sound," she said finally. Her voice wasn't soft, but it had a steadiness that made you want to listen. "What kind of sound?" I asked. She gave a half-smile. "The kind that makes you think it's nothing until it gets worse." That made me laugh, quietly. "That's most of them." She looked at me then, really looked, and for a second, the noise of the fan, the ticking of tools, the song on the radio, all of it just faded. Her name was Elena. I learned a minute later, when she passed me her keys. Our fingers brushed. Accident, I told myself, but the warmth lingered longer than it should have. While she waited, she wandered around the shop, eyes tracing the walls, the tools, the photos pinned above the counter. She asked about the picture of my father and me, the one taken before he passed. Most people don't ask. They just glance and move on. "I'm sorry," she said, not with pity, but with a kind of understanding that didn't need to sound pretty. I nodded, tightening a bolt just to keep my hands busy. "It was a while ago." "You kept the shop," she said. "That's something." I don't know why that hit me. Maybe because she said it like it mattered. Like staying meant strength, not just routine. When I told her I'd need about 20 minutes to check the noise, she didn't leave. She sat on the bench near the window, watching the rain start to thread down the glass. The street outside went quiet. I kept stealing glances, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she looked like someone who carried too much silence and had learned how to wear it well. At one point, she pulled out a book from her bag and started reading. I remember the sound of the pages turning, the soft scrape of her shoe against the floor, the rhythm of my heartbeat out of sync with the hum of the fluorescent light. "Do you always read while you wait?" I asked. "Only when I'm tired of waiting for other things," she said, not looking up. That line, it shouldn't have stayed with me, but it did. When I told her the car was fine, just a loose bracket, she smiled. Relieved, maybe, or amused. I didn't ask. She thanked me, handed me cash, and said she'd bring coffee next time if I ever fixed something else for her. "Deal," I said, trying to sound casual. Her hand brushed mine again when she took the receipt. Not deliberate, but too soft to be coincidence. After she left, I found myself standing at the door, watching the taillights fade into the rain. The bell above the door swayed once more, ringing a second too late. I told myself it was nothing, just the usual pull of something new, something out of reach. But that night, I caught myself replaying her voice in my head, the shape of that half-smile, and the way she said waiting for other things, like maybe she'd been waiting for this too. And I knew then, even if I'd never admit it, that moment wasn't done with me yet. It had been 3 weeks since Elena's car rolled into my shop, but her voice still lived somewhere in the back of my mind, like the low hum of an engine that never really turns off. When she showed up again, it wasn't for the car. The rain had started early that morning, steady and unhurried, and I was closing the shutters when her reflection appeared in the glass. She stood there with an umbrella, hair damp at the edges, a folder clutched in one hand. "Do you fix generators too?" she asked when I opened the door. Her tone was casual, but her eyes, they darted once, quick, betraying something else. "Sometimes," I said. "Depends how broken." Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Mine just stopped. The lights in my place keep flickering. So I drove up to her house, a small place on the edge of town, half hidden behind old oaks. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and something floral, maybe her perfume. She led me to the back room where the generator sat. Books were stacked everywhere, on chairs, on the floor, beside the window. "You read all these?" I asked, crouching near the machine. I start most of them, she said quietly. Finishing is harder. Something about the way she said it made me look up. Her expression was steady, but her hand, resting on the edge of a shelf, trembled once before she tucked it into her pocket. Long day? I asked, trying to sound light. She tilted her head, as if weighing the truth. Long few years. I nodded, tightening a screw I didn't need to tighten. The generator wasn't really the reason she'd asked for help. I could tell, not from words, but from the silence between them. When the power flickered back on, she stood beside me, close enough that I could smell the rain still clinging to her coat. I noticed her hands, slender, a small cut on one knuckle, maybe from cooking or gardening. There was something lonely about the way she held them, like they hadn't been held by anyone else in a long time. You didn't have to come all the way out here, she said after a moment. I wanted to, I admitted before I could stop myself. She turned to look at me then, a small, tired smile ghosting across her face. You shouldn't say things like that. Why not? Because sometimes people mean them. The air between us went still, like even the hum of the generator knew to stay quiet. She moved first, brushing past me to open a window. The cold air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves. For a second, her shoulder grazed mine, not an invitation, but not avoidance either. When she turned back, she met my eyes for just a heartbeat too long. Something unspoken flickered there. Fear, maybe, or the memory of wanting. Thank you, she said softly, as if to end it before it could start. I nodded, but my chest felt too full for a simple "you're welcome." As I left, she stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the cold, watching until my truck disappeared down the drive. That night, I couldn't shake the image, her fingers tracing the window frame. The way her voice broke just slightly when she said sometimes people mean them. And I knew she was right, I did. But I also knew that whatever this was, it was already too late to pretend I didn't. The rain came harder that night, the kind that made the streets blur and the world feel smaller. Elena had asked if I could stop by to check the generator again. It kept cutting out when the weather turned. I told myself it was just another job, but I didn't believe it. Her porch light flickered when I pulled up. She opened the door before I could knock, barefoot, holding a candle in one hand. Power's gone again, she said, and I didn't want to sit here in the dark. Her voice carried a kind of apology, though she hadn't done anything wrong. I followed her inside, boots heavy with rain. The candlelight softened everything, her face, the walls, even the silence between us. I'll take a look, I said, trying to sound steady. But the generator didn't need fixing this time. It was fine. She just didn't want to be alone. I didn't want her to be either. She poured tea, lukewarm, too much honey, and we sat by the kitchen window, the storm tapping at the glass. She asked about my mother, about whether I ever thought of leaving town. She spoke less about herself, but when she did, her words came slow, deliberate. I used to think quiet meant peace, she said, staring out into the dark. Now I think it's just what's left when everything else stops making noise. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't. Instead, I watched her fingers trace the rim of her mug, slow circles that matched the rhythm of my heartbeat. There was something in that motion, something fragile, something that wanted to be held but didn't know how to ask. When thunder rolled, she flinched, just slightly, and I saw it, the brief tremor in her composure. Without thinking, I reached across the table, resting my hand near hers. Not touching, just close enough that she could, if she wanted to. She didn't move. The silence stretched, thick with all the words we weren't saying. I could see her eyes glint in the candlelight, distant, searching. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her face changed, not dramatically, just enough. She pressed the phone to her chest, unread, and gave a small, brittle laugh. Old habits, she murmured. They always find their way back. I wanted to ask who it was, what it meant, but I didn't. Some questions don't sound right spoken aloud. Do you ever wish you could forget something on purpose? She asked. I nodded. Every day. Her gaze lingered on me then, long enough to make the room feel warmer, smaller. For a second, I thought she might reach for me. I thought I might let her. The candle flickered. The rain softened. The air between us felt like a held breath. But she stood. Slowly. You should go, she said, voice low but steady. Before the storm traps you here. I wanted to say that maybe I didn't mind being trapped. That maybe this was the first place in a long time that didn't feel like somewhere to leave. But I didn't. She walked me to the door, the faintest smile on her lips, the phone still in her hand. When I stepped outside, the rain hit cold and sharp. I looked back once. She was still there, framed by candlelight, unread message glowing in her palm. Her lips moved, maybe forming a word, maybe not. And for a moment, one heartbeat, one breath, I almost turned back. Almost. I didn't see her for a week. Then, one afternoon, she walked into the shop again, not with a broken car this time, but with nothing to fix. She stood by the doorway, arms crossed, eyes softer than I remembered. I was driving by, she said. Thought I'd say hi. I nodded, pretending not to care that my pulse jumped. Hi. She gave a small laugh, the kind that sounds like it doesn't know if it should exist. Then she walked closer, stopping just beside the counter. The light in the shop was low. Dust hung in the air like something waiting to settle. I could smell her perfume again, faint, but familiar. Something about it made the whole place feel smaller. I wanted to apologize, she said finally, for the other night. You don't have to, I said. I know. She paused, looking down at her hands. But I need to. Her voice wavered slightly, just once. It was the first time I'd heard it break. I shouldn't have called you over, she continued. It wasn't about the generator. She hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't come. I didn't want to be alone. There it was. The truth, simple, quiet, heavier than anything else she could have said. I swallowed hard. You could have said that. She looked up at me, and for a second I saw something raw in her expression, something that made me want to reach across the counter and erase the space between us. I didn't think I was allowed to, she said. That silence that followed, it didn't feel empty. It felt full. Every glance, every half-finished word we'd been hiding behind had led to this. Her honesty, and my inability to know what to do with it. Elena, I started then stopped. The way her name felt in my mouth, it wasn't casual anymore. What are we doing? She asked suddenly, voice barely above a whisper. Because this, she gestured between us. This isn't nothing. And I don't know what it is either. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She looked like someone who'd already done enough of that when no one was watching. I don't know, I admitted. But I keep thinking about you. About that night. About how you looked when the candle went out. She exhaled, eyes closing briefly, as if the confession was both wanted and unbearable. This shouldn't happen, she said. It already is. She shook her head, half smiling, half breaking. You're too young to understand what it costs to need someone you shouldn't. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I stepped closer, not touching, just near enough to feel her presence like static. Maybe, but I understand what it's like to stop pretending you don't. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us pulsed with everything we couldn't say. Her breathing steadied, shallow but rhythmic. She looked at me, really looked, and whispered, almost to herself, "You make me remember who I was before I learned how to stay quiet." And then she turned and walked out, the bell above the door chiming like the end of something neither of us had the courage to name. She didn't come back for almost a month. By then, I'd stopped expecting her to. I kept busy, fixing things that didn't need fixing, talking to customers without really hearing them. But every time the bell above the door chimed, I still looked up too fast. Then, one evening near closing, I found a small brown envelope on the counter. No name, just my shop's address written in tight, neat handwriting. Inside was a photograph, a man in his 30s, standing beside a car much like mine, sunlight flaring behind him. On the back, a few words written in ink that had slightly bled into the paper. "He looked like you." No explanation. Just that. My chest tightened. I didn't have to guess who it was from. I stared at the photo for a long time, the edges damp from my hands. The man's expression was calm, easy, someone who didn't know yet that he'd end up living in someone else's memory. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every glance, every pause, every half-swallowed word she'd ever given me. The way she'd said, "You make me remember who I was before I learned how to stay quiet." The next morning, I drove to her house. The porch light was off, the windows dark, but her car was there. I stood by the door, uncertain, until it opened. She looked surprised, though not entirely. She was wearing an oversized sweater, sleeves pushed up, hair uncombed, a version of her I hadn't seen before. Softer, realer. "You got it," she said quietly, eyes flicking to the envelope in my hand. "Who is he?" I asked. My voice came out rougher than I meant. She leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms. "My husband," she said. "Was." The word landed like a dull ache. "He died 8 years ago. Car accident." I wasn't with him. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. I just stood there, the photo heavy in my hand. "I don't talk about him," she continued, eyes distant. "People stop asking after a while. They think silence means healing. It doesn't. It just changes shape." The wind shifted, leaves brushed the steps. She looked at me then, a sad smile trembling on her lips. "When I met you, I thought I was just remembering." The way he laughed, the way he fixed things, the way he stood in a room and didn't rush to fill it with words. "And now?" I asked quietly. "Now," she said, "I don't know if I miss him, or if I miss the part of me that loved him." Her voice cracked then, the first real break I'd heard from her. Without thinking, I reached out, fingers brushing the sleeve of her sweater. She didn't move away, but she didn't move closer either. "You shouldn't have to choose," I said. She looked up, eyes shining, rain beginning to fall again behind her. "Maybe not," she whispered. "But some loves leave you standing in 2 different lives, and you can't step fully into either one." The air between us went still, the kind of stillness that feels like it's waiting to become something else. She closed her eyes, a single tear cutting down her cheek, and said the quietest thing I'd ever heard. "You were never supposed to remind me how it felt to be alive." For days after that night, we didn't speak. I told myself to let it fade, to give her space, to give myself some version of peace, but silence has its own gravity. The longer it stretched, the more it pulled. Then one evening, near dusk, I found myself driving again. No plan, no reason. Just the low hum of the road and the half-hope that maybe she'd be there. Her house looked softer this time, touched by the orange wash of sunset. Through the window, I saw her sitting on the floor beside the couch, papers scattered around her like fallen leaves. She didn't notice me until I knocked. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised, just tired, in the way that comes from too much thinking, not lack of sleep. "I was sorting things," she said, "trying to let some of them go." She gestured to the papers, old photos, letters, pieces of a life she was still half living. I hesitated in the doorway. "Do you want help?" "No," she said softly, then after a pause, "but maybe company." So I sat down beside her, careful not to disturb the small, fragile world around her. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall. She picked up a photograph, one of her husband, younger, laughing, and stared at it for a long moment. Then she placed it gently into a box. "I thought keeping everything meant I was honoring him," she said. "But maybe I was just keeping myself stuck." I nodded, not trusting my voice. She turned to me then, her gaze steady but softer than I'd ever seen it. "You remind me of what came after him, not instead of him." Something in my chest eased. Not joy, not relief, just a quiet acceptance that maybe love didn't have to replace anything to be real. For a long while, we said nothing. The world outside dimmed. The air in the room thickened with unspoken things that no longer needed to be spoken. At some point, her hand found mine. Not searching, not trembling, just resting there, as if it had been meant to be there all along. We stayed like that, her shoulder against mine, the two of us surrounded by remnants of old lives neither of us could fully leave behind. The clock kept ticking, the light faded, and for the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It just was. After a while, she leaned her head against my shoulder, eyes closed, a breath escaping like something long held finally released. "I don't know where this goes," she murmured. "Me neither," I said. We didn't move. Didn't need to. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of rain again, A reminder, maybe, that everything ends, everything begins, and sometimes both happen at the same time. Her fingers tightened around mine, barely there, almost nothing. And somehow, that almost was enough. It's strange, looking back now, how something so small, a sound in an engine, a quiet glance, a cup of bad tea, could open a door I didn't even know was there. It's been almost a year since that night on her living room floor. The shop still smells the same: oil, dust, rain-soaked air drifting in from the open door. But I'm not the same person sweeping its corners anymore. Elena still comes by sometimes. Not often, just enough to remind me that what we have doesn't need a name to be real. She stands by the counter, says she's checking on her car, then laughs when I tell her it's fine. Always fine. We don't talk about that first storm, or the photograph, or the words we almost said. We don't have to. Everything important sits quietly between us. In the pauses, the small looks, the ease of silence that once felt impossible. What I've learned, and maybe this is the part that took the longest, is that love isn't always about the beginning or the end. Sometimes it's about the middle, the staying. The quiet spaces that don't ask for promises, just presence. She taught me that healing isn't loud. It's slow. It's the sound of someone breathing beside you when you thought you'd forgotten how to be understood. I think she changed too. There's more light in her now. Not constant, not all at once, but enough to notice. She still keeps some distance, still looks away when things get too close. But there's softness in it now. Forgiveness, maybe. A few weeks ago, she brought me coffee again, the same way she promised that first day. She placed the cup on the counter, looked at me with that half smile that always undoes me a little, and said, "You still think it's just infatuation?" I smiled back, shaking my head. "No," I said. "I think it's something that chose us." She didn't answer, just reached across the counter and brushed her fingers against mine, the same way she did that very first time, and somehow it felt both brand new and deeply familiar. When she left, the bell above the door chimed again. Same sound, same soft echo, but this time, it didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like something that had finally learned how to stay. He said it was just infatuation. I replied, "Then let it be my lifetime." If you've ever met someone who changed you quietly, not with grand gestures, but with stillness, you know what I mean. Sometimes the things we can't define are the ones that stay with us the longest. Tell me, have you ever loved someone who arrived too late, and still somehow, right on time?